So just a little bit of housekeeping. As the coordinator of Blyth Valley Green Party, it's policy whenever speaking in public on a subject that I make clear the current national policy for England and Wales. So the Green Party recognises that trans men are men and trans women are women, and that non-binary identities exist and are valid under section RR 530. That is also my personal position on certain circumstances. However, I also disagree with their policy on prostitution and currently favour the Nordic model. I recognise that this may not be the position shared by some of you here, and yet I am not only participating in the debate, but I am speaking on the panel. I would like to highlight to any detractors of a woman's place. I am being given a platform by some people, some of whom's opinions I disagree with. It also means I am uniquely positioned to be hated by both groups. I would like to offer my thanks to the other speakers on the panel for graciously allowing me to participate and for refusing to censor anything I wish to discuss, because I believe it is precisely because we disagree on such issues and yet I am still being engaged that is the most vital part of tonight's meeting. Several months ago, when I was first asked to speak, it was in response to some very heated and vitriolic and hateful debates on social media. What struck me most was the majority of the people who were being targeted were not from right-wing political factions one might normally associate with opposition to personal freedoms, censorship, and violence. Following several rather unpleasant social media encounters, in which I was singled out, threatened, and doxxed. This happened on a variety of social media platforms. The hostility of the dialogue and the blatant nature of the threats, including complaints made to both my national party headquarters and my regional representatives, neither of whom, to their credit, pressurised me not to speak or again even attempted to censor my speech. One thing we do agree on is that bullying women will never be okay. Discriminating against women will never be okay, and I'm here as an act of solidarity to support women's rights to free speech, freedom of expression, and to openly discuss, without fear of intimidation, policies which impact the legal standing and well-being of women and girls within the UK. I appreciate the purpose of this meeting is to discuss possible impacts on the Gender Recognition Act, yet feel it is important to remember at this stage the proposed changes have not been made. Every change is speculative, every situation hypothetical. To put that in context of today's meeting, women here are being harassed for potentially discussing something which does not yet even exist, which must truly be a new low in the delegitimisation of women's opinions. When the original Act came into existence in 2004, myself, and I would hazard a guess to a large majority of the general population, did not understand or even aware of the legislation. Now that Theresa May has put reform of the GRA on the table, we are now in a position of speculating what those changes are and how those will impact and affect women and girls. This is important, and we need to talk about this. The structure of Channel 4's recent Gender Quake series, particularly the roundtable debate with Caitlin Jenner, Jermaine Greer, and Sarah Dittam, was inherently flawed and appears to have angered participants and viewers on both sides. Although I disagree with many points made by model Monroe Berghoff, she was correct to assert that trans women are also the victims of male violence. What was incorrect was she did so by speaking over a woman making a point on a completely separate issue. There are no doubt many concerns about the impact of the proposed changes to the GRA, some of which will manifest themselves and some will not. I'm not suggesting male sexual predators will undergo expensive gender reassignment surgery in simply to attack women in safe spaces, nor am I suggesting male sexual predators will undertake self-ID via legal deed poll in order to attack those same spaces. Criminals tend not to seek permission slips. Suggesting trans women will suddenly run rampant in public changing rooms, refugees and hospitals, hospital wards, sexually assaulting women, when I think they are also likely to be victims of abuse. But the central question becomes, will reformations to a bureaucratic process for transgender individuals pose an increased risk to the safety of already vulnerable women and girls? The irony is, by preventing any dialogue on the issue and intimidating women from openly discussing their concerns, activists not only play into but reinforce those initial concerns. It becomes hard to argue the transgender community are just wanting to get on with their lives when women, many of whom are long-standing campaigners of LGBT+ rights, are assaulted merely for engaging in public debate. It it becomes self-perpetuating and ultimately self-fulfilling. Regardless, we must not be afraid or intimidated to challenge the presence of people in any spaces we believe to be a threat to women and girls, continuing to uphold perpetrators of violence accountable and not their victims. One thing the proposed reformation of the GRA has done is to raise the several wider issues of inequality between women and girls that desperately need addressing. Whether or not they will be achieved through a similar reformation to the Equality Act in 2010 remains to be seen. I do fear in the discussion regarding safe spaces that we are being drawn into the myth of stranger danger. Women's Aid conducted a femicide census in 2016. Of the 113 women killed by men in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, 85 died in their homes. 9 out of 10 were murdered by someone they knew. Of these, 78 women were killed in by their current or former intimate partner. Also, personally, I'm sick of being told that my toilet in my house is gender neutral. Firstly, private home bathrooms are a separate enclosed room as compared to most public bathrooms, which are separate stalls with a room with gaps of several inches above and below the door. Secondly, everyone inside my home is pre-vetted when they walk through the front door. It would only be comparable if I came down at 3 a.m. and was confronted by someone in my bathroom I did not know, at which point I have greater concerns than asserting someone's gender identity. If any women or girls feel threatened in non-segregated spaces, we owe it to them not to delegitimize their feelings and their personal experience. But from personal experience myself, there is no such thing as a safe space. The times when I have been sexually assaulted, my assailants were known to me in places that were familiar. As a teenager, I spent New Year's Eve with my boyfriend's friend. At 5 a.m, as an unexpected guest, I thought nothing of crashing out on the family sofa in the living room, only to wake a few hours later to find one of his friends leaning over me, stroking my hair while masturbating. I walked out and headed for the only place in the house with a lockable door, ironically the bathroom, where I stayed until he left. In the morning, nothing was done, because it was just one of those things. These stories are so commonplace. However, I am concerned that the toxicity of the debate has now reached an impasse where neither side can hear each other because they are talking at the same time. I do not necessarily agree with every single opinion of every single woman in this room, nor do I support everything that the Rad Fem movement stands for, or indeed everything the Green Party stands for. But once the left wing adopts practices of fascism, namely censoring of free speech and advocating violence, then we have reached the end of something. When recently I asked the regional advocate for the trans community why there was such a high suicide rate within the trans community, I was told feminists and attendees of A Woman's Place were, I quote, complicit in the social prejudice, discrimination and hate that cause trans people misery, pain, suffering, mental health issues, self-harm and even death. While I emphatically deny any causation between women discussing implications of a proposed bill to be directly responsible, if words can be so toxic, then surely sexually violent threats like rape you with my lady dick, kill all TERFs and die cis scum are equally dehumanizing. Perhaps we need to be all tactful about our choice of language. As it appears that once someone has been smeared with a particular label, they are considered fair game for targeted campaigns of bullying, myself included. Despite my position and years of support for the LGBTIQA community, I can't help thinking once Peter Tatchell is identified as an enemy, then we're all fucked. Recently, this tribal mentality of two opposing factions has manifested itself in the unlikely battleground of women's sports. In 2014, when trans woman MMA fighter Fallon Fox fought against Tamika Brents, Brent suffered a concussion, an orbital bone fracture, and several staples to the head in the first round. Quote, I fought a lot of women and have never felt the strength that I felt in a fight as I did that night. At the time when Fox was initially issued a license, all voices claiming Fox had an unfair advantage as a trans woman were shut down as transphobic. Despite, or possibly because of the severity of the injuries received by Brent, several trans rights activists took to Twitter expressing elation that Brent, who was a prominent lesbian, had her blood spilled on the mat by Fox. Following this and several other controversies, in 2015, the IOC consensus meeting agreed the following guidelines when determining eligibility to compete in male and female competition. 1. Those who transition from female to male are eligible to compete in the male category without restriction. 2. Those who transition from male to female are eligible to compete in the female category under the following conditions. The athlete has declared her gender identity as female. The declaration cannot be changed for sporting purposes for a minimum of 4 years. The athlete must demonstrate that her total testosterone in serum is below 10 nanomils per litre for at least 12 months prior to her first competition. One of the main contributors to this policy was a single research paper. Ms. Joanna Harper, Chief Medical Physicist, Radiologist at the University Providence Portland Medical Centre, conducted a single study in 2015 with only one sport, running, and with only 8 participants. The closing sentence in her 2015 paper stated, "It will take many more years before the average sport enthusiast understands that transgender women who have undergone testosterone suppression will not dominate women's sports." In March 2017, Australian international Melbourne transgender weightlifter Lauren Hubbard, in the 90 kilogram plus category, lifted a combined total of 268 kilograms. That was nearly a 3-stone increase than the silver medalist position. In December 2017, the Chief Executive of the Australian Federation, Mike Keelan, wrote to the International Weightlifting Federation calling Hubbard to be excluded from the Games. In his opinion, "In our respectful view, the current criteria and its application has the potential to devalue women's weightlifting and discourage female-born athletes from pursuing the sport at an elite level in the future." Research published in 2013 in the Journal of Physiology entitled "A Cellular Memory Mechanism Aids Overloads Hypertrophy in Muscle Long After Episodic Exposure to Anabolic Steroids." In short, the researchers theorized the impact of doping could be a lifetime and far more than the 2-year suspension for the current ban. In 2018, Professor Alison Heather, a physiology researcher at the University of Otago in New Zealand, discussed Lauren Hubbard's performance. "A man transitioning to a female has physiological advantages that they take into their new female-based life on the previous male life. Men generally have bigger hearts, bigger lungs, stronger bones, bigger bone structure, and more muscle mass. None of these metrics are currently markers for the IOC policy. And all this begs the question, is this fair?" In April 2018, Lauren was forced out of the competition games with a dislocation injury, and an important distinction to that and the injuries inflicted by Fallon Fox was that Lauren's injuries, to all intents and purposes, were self-inflicted. So why does this matter? Because in the search for new understanding, it is women, not men, who are being compromised. Women whose sports ranking and public persona are affected if they refuse to fight or compete with a transgender athlete, or risk injury if they do. We need to be incentivizing, not discouraging women and girls from playing sport and undertaking a more healthy lifestyle. How can we do this in good conscience if at the most elevated level there is an implicit unfairness and bias, and regulations are changing on an almost daily basis? Professor Yannis Pistalis from the IOC Medical and Scientific Commission and Professor of Sport at the University of Brighton is about to launch what he believes is the first study in changing sporting capabilities of athletes as they transition from male to female or female to male. He said it would establish whether transgender women who had taken hormones retained an advantage. "It may be that after the process, the muscle remains a male muscle," he said. Ms. Harper's latest paper, published in February 2018, suggests the future of the possibility of a third category of intersex athletes, although whether this will include transgender women is unsure. Only 4 weeks ago, the IOC brought in new regulations to reduce the testosterone threshold from 10 nanomoles to 5 nanomoles, literally halving the threshold for which transgender and intersex athletes can compete. This will apply to 55 sports federations and will come into effect on the Tokyo Olympics in 2020. So the Olympics is a long way from our starting point of the GRA. But in the end, it should all come back to fairness, equality, and safety. In summary, I believe we have a range of disagreements on a highly contentious subject of the GRA. But I would remind ourselves of Voltaire's quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." But of course we know they weren't even his words. They belong to his female biographer, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, who in 1906 wrote it in Friends of Voltaire, which was completed under a pseudonym. It is deeply sad, in the centenary of women's suffrage, we are still being deplatformed and silenced, and written out of history books. So I humbly take this opportunity to rewrite Evelyn back in. Thank you very much.